Wales will go into a short, sharp national lockdown from Friday. Almost everyone must stay at home. The 2-week fire break means all non-essential businesses will shut, households will be banned from mixing anywhere, older children won't go back to school after half-term.
A fire break period is our best chance of regaining control of the virus and avoiding a much longer and much more damaging national lockdown.
But there's anger at the blanket approach in some parts of Wales, like Pembrokeshire, where infection rates are still very low.
I don't think it's fair that we're being locked down with the rest of Wales, and we have very low numbers. We've all been very careful in these small rural communities.
No agreement after days of discussions between the government and local leaders over moving Greater Manchester into tighter restrictions. Now the government says it's carefully considering the next steps. Also on the programme tonight. Flown to London, the conjoined twins from Pakistan finally go home after their extraordinary treatment at Great Ormond Street. A man tells the Manchester Arena inquiry that he saw Salman Abedi in the moments before he detonated his device, saying he immediately thought he was a suicide bomber. And how cold water swimmers are helping scientists working on a possible cure for dementia.
And coming up in sport on BBC News, Wasps are on the verge of having to forfeit their place in Rugby Union's Premiership final after more positive COVID tests.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. On Friday, Wales will go into a 2-week national lockdown. The First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said he was imposing the fire break with a heavy heart, but he insisted that the sharp and deep measures were necessary to regain control of the virus and to prevent the NHS from becoming overwhelmed. The decision has sparked anger in some parts of Wales where the number of cases is still low. The lockdown will last 2 weeks. It starts at 6 p.m. on Friday. Everyone must stay at home unless you are a key worker or cannot work from home. You can't mix with other households anywhere. All non-essential businesses must close. Primary school children will return after half-term, as will secondary school pupils in years 7 and 8. All others will learn from home again. You can still exercise outdoors. Parks will stay open. Takeaways will be allowed, childcare facilities will be open, and adults living alone can see their support bubble. Well, our Wales correspondent Hal Griffiths joins us now from Cardiff. Hal.
Sophie, back in the summer, Wales was the slowest of the nations to ease lockdown measures. Now it's the first to go back to square one, back to a full lockdown, back to staying at home. While coronavirus case rates vary widely across the country, we're told that local measures are no longer enough. And so, from Friday, a full national shutdown affecting everyone across the country.
Stay at home. 3 words that brought life to a standstill in spring, now an instruction for Wales in autumn. This cafe bar in Cardiff will close. The government says people must be confined to their houses again for a fortnight to stop the virus spreading.
A fire break period is our best chance of regaining control of the virus and avoiding a much longer and much more damaging national lockdown. The window we have within which to act is only a small one.
Many had anticipated the news, but it's split opinion. Dewi and Nuria are divided.
Well, what concerns me is that it's blown out of all proportion, is that it doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference of these lockdowns.
It has to be done, because I've been looking at the numbers closely and they have gone up really quickly.
Leisure, hospitality and tourism businesses will close.
Elliot's the manager here. He's frustrated that in summer the government was encouraging people to go out. Now it's shutting them in again.
We've had many more customers than we would have expected through August coming in a time where a virus is spreading, and I think it's irresponsible on the part of the government, and it's led to this. Now we have to suffer after we followed the rules.
Across Wales, Halloween is cancelled, bonfire night too. But while coronavirus case numbers are high here in Cardiff, over in Pembrokeshire there are far fewer signs of a second wave and questions over why here too they must shut down.
I don't think it's fair that we're being locked down with the rest of Wales, and we have very low numbers. We've all been very careful in these small rural communities, and we've just done everything as carefully and safely as we can.
The Welsh Government warns it must act to stop hospitals from being overwhelmed. Last week, the number of COVID-related patients rose by 50%. This new intensive care unit will open in the lockdown. They desperately want to avoid cancelling elective care.
Kind of preparing for the worst. You know, we've dusted back off our surge plans. We've got all the spare ventilators back out the cupboard. But I think it's with a heavy heart. And we kind of think we can't... Last time, we turned the whole hospital off pretty much. Every spare member of staff was brought to ITU and retrained. Well, they're busy now. They're busy in theatres doing operations. We don't have that luxury again.
Businesses will need a lifeline too. This brewery has 160 pubs, but they didn't all survive the first lockdown.
A lot of beer has just gone down the drain. You know, tragically, about 100 people have lost their jobs.
Now the boss is worried this short, sharp shutdown may be followed by several more.
This is like sharpening a pencil. If you keep sharpening the pencil, in the end, there's nothing left. You know, you can't just keep chipping away at an industry, knocking it down, expecting it to get back up again in great shape. You know, every time we lose turnover, we lay off people, we have to close pubs, sell pubs, the business gets smaller and weaker. And that will be not just us, it will be affecting everybody in this sector.
A firebreak can only slow, not extinguish the danger. Lives and livelihoods depend on its success.
New widespread restrictions will come into force across Wales on Friday. And just to give you an idea of how infection rates in Wales compare to the rest of the UK, the figures for last week show Northern Ireland has by far the most, with 385 cases per 100,000 people, followed by England, Scotland and then Wales with the fewest. Well, let's talk to Hal in Cardiff. Many people will wonder why Wales is alone in taking such drastic action, given those figures.
Yeah, the case rates may be lower, but the Welsh Government makes no apology for its abundance of caution. Remember back in the summer, this is where pubs remained closed while others across the border were open. Shops here were very slow in opening too. And so this is a precautionary, preemptive strike, if you like. However, the difficulty will be, and the Welsh Government again admits this, they won't see the results within those 2 weeks. In fact, it could be several weeks before any impact is felt. It's all about slowing rather than getting rid of the virus. But of course the Welsh Government can't act alone. It depends on UK government support for many of its businesses, and this 2 and a bit week firebreak actually straddles 2 different types of furlough scheme. So some companies here are going to be really confused as to how they pull on the financial support they'll need to get them through this. And as we've heard, many already fear this short, sharp shock won't be the last one they have to endure.
Hal, thank you. Meanwhile, in England, there's no agreement after days of talks between the government and local leaders in Greater Manchester over whether the region should be moved into the highest alert level, Tier 3, along with the Liverpool City region and Lancashire. The government says it's now carefully considering the next steps. Danny Savage is in Stockport for us tonight. Danny.
So the impression we got from both sides today is that they were having discussions, and we know meetings have taken place, but there's been no agreement, if you like. We understand that the sticking point still appears to be a financial one, namely funds surrounding money for a hardship fund, so the local authority here can top up the salaries of low-paid workers who would perhaps be laid off if these tier 3 restrictions come into force. In the last few minutes, we've had statements from both sides who said they want to continue discussions and continue to go forward. But that is the question now. What happens? Will we get an agreement, or will we see the government impose restrictions on Greater Manchester?
The government says Manchester should already be in very high alert Tier 3, but the standoff between leaders here and Westminster continues. So life carries on in Tier 2, to the concern of some.
I would like to see those restrictions coming into force and not just being in place but being enforced to really try and get to grips with the pandemic and actually trying to get things back under control.
It means you can still do things like meet friends outside. Sue thinks the area isn't ready for tighter rules, saying track and trace using these QR codes isn't ingrained enough in people's habits.
I mainly go into Stockport, but there aren't really any, not that I've seen in Stockport, for you to QR code, and there's definitely nobody checking that you're doing it or checking that you've sanitised your hands.
I wish all people in charge would start pulling in one direction.
Julia thinks agreement is needed now, and the government has to spend what's necessary.
We can't let people starve. We can't let people not be able to pay their bills. Okay, we're going to run up huge debts. There'll be time to fix it down the road. Don't ask me how we'll fix it.
The government could impose further restrictions on Greater Manchester without the agreement of local leaders. But if those like Mayor Andy Burnham strongly object, then will people here follow those rules? That's the dilemma. So ideally this row needs to be settled soon and peacefully. The move to the highest alert tier does feel inevitable, but after days of discussions, will there ever be a deal that's good to go? Danny Savage, BBC News, Greater Manchester.
This afternoon, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock warned of the growing number of people over the age of 60 in the northwest of England who are now getting the virus. Liverpool has by far the highest numbers, but there's been a sharp rise in Greater Manchester in the past week. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes has been assessing the capacity of hospitals across the northwest.
In happier times, this would be a busy, bustling city centre. But Manchester is quieter now, poised perhaps to enter the highest COVID alert level, Tier 3. The row over how and when that is to happen rumbles on, with ministers in London warning older people are now increasingly at risk from the virus.
I'm very worried that the cases per 100,000 among the over 60s is 401 in the Liverpool City region, 241 in Lancashire, and in Greater Manchester has risen from over the past week from 171 to 283.
Local health leaders acknowledge the seriousness of the situation, but say it's not out of control.
We're not overwhelmed. I think I want people to realise that it is a serious position that we're in. We have seen a steady rise in our admissions, both into hospital and into intensive care, but we have very detailed escalation plans in place.
The latest COVID-19 infection data shows the rate in the city of Manchester continues to fall to 410 cases per 100,000 people. In Nottingham, it's 655, while in Derry and Strabane in Northern Ireland, it's 939. But in many ways, it's not the infection rate that counts, it's the number who fall so seriously ill they end up in hospital, needing intensive care. And that puts enormous pressure on a health service that is already under stress.
Here in Greater Manchester, there are currently around about 250 critical care beds that are available, although that number could be increased quite quickly if more beds and staff become available. Now, I understand that capacity is currently running at around 85%, which is not unusual at this time of year. But ministers in London are warning that spare capacity could be wiped out within 3 weeks by a surge in COVID patients. And senior doctors I've spoken to say that is consistent with modelling that they've also seen.
Intensive care specialists are worried about the impact on patients and a health service that's still catching up on delayed surgery and treatments.
I think the added pressure of COVID infection is putting a huge strain on the system, and I think all NHS staff are extremely worried that we're in for a very bumpy ride over the winter months.
What's happening here in the northwest of England could be a template for what happens elsewhere very soon. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, the latest government figures showed there were 18,804 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means the average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is 17,649. Daily hospital admissions have risen, with 853 people being admitted on average each day over the past week. This number doesn't include Scotland. 80 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means on average in the past week, 122 deaths were announced every day. It takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 43,726. Our health editor Hugh Pym is with me now. Put all these figures in context for us now. We've got more than 850 people going into hospital every day at the moment. Are these numbers accelerating rapidly?
Well, no, Sophie, they're not accelerating rapidly. They're going up across the UK. But on 3 days last week, up until last Thursday, the latest for which we have UK stats, they were between 800 and 900. And in the northwest of England, very much in the spotlight at the moment, between 200 and 300 on several days last week. So not an acceleration. But the question is, where do they go from here? And as we heard in Dominic's piece, there are projections which were published by the government at Westminster for Manchester on how much more might be needed from hospitals, intensive care capacity. Now, the prediction is that by October the 28th, all free intensive care capacity will be used up in Manchester on current trends. Now, you can model that because you know at the moment how many people have got the virus, and there's normally a delay for the sickest to end up in hospital. But beyond that, there's a projection from the government, the Cabinet Office, that by November the 12th, the entire surge capacity of intensive care in Manchester will be used up. That's all the extra beds and the ventilators that could be brought on stream. That is very much a projection. Who knows exactly what will happen from here? Behaviour could change. There could be a response to restrictions in place. So a lot of numbers being thrown around tonight. No one's doubting it's a serious situation, but these are projections rather than forecasts.
Hugh, thank you. Ministers in the Irish government are meeting to decide whether to move Ireland into the highest level of coronavirus restrictions. It's expected they will announce nationwide measures which will last for up to 6 weeks. Our Ireland correspondent m000n is on the border at County Monaghan.
Ireland has seen a rapid increase in cases over the past fortnight. Almost a quarter of cases recorded during the whole pandemic here came within the past 2 weeks. Now, this county is one of those currently under the strictest restrictions, but those measures may increase for everybody across the Republic of Ireland, in particular, as you say, non-essential shops having to close once more. But the hope is from some in government here that a return to lockdown measures now may mean getting back to some sort of normality in time for Christmas. Counties along the Irish border have been some of the worst affected as cases of the virus have climbed for a second time. For Micheál, who doubles as a funeral director and shop manager in the village of Inniskeen.
Hello, good afternoon, how are you doing?
The virus is feeling increasingly present.
It's coming very close in the local community here. It's coming practically nearly to every house.
Do you think it'll be harder this time around?
Coming into the darker evenings and that, and people are housebound, they can't get out for a walk, they can't walk the dog, they can't exercise, so they're stuck inside the house and they have no comfort or whatever.
Well, Ireland has a tiered system. This county is in Tier 4. People have been told they'll have a few days to prepare if they're moved to Tier 5, the highest level of restrictions and close to where things were back in March.
For me, I'm a takeaway business, and you have more people coming in because everything's closed. People just want to release to get out somewhere, but a lot of older people still won't leave the house.
Tonight, the Irish government is expected to announce that non-essential businesses must close across Ireland for several weeks. The decisions of Ireland's ministers today come shortly after a new wave of restrictions in Northern Ireland began on Friday.
It's getting things right, and this is complicated. There's a huge amount of implications for people's everyday lives. I think it's appropriate that we try and get the arrangements and the details right in that time.
But while the Republic of Ireland is expected to keep schools open, Northern Ireland, which has some of the highest levels of infection in the UK, closed schools from today. An extra week on the half-term break.
Certainly if this break was to continue beyond 2 weeks, I think the pressures that would be brought to bear would be enormous to try to see, can we really have to make a change for this year, because it's just, you know, it's proving to be impossible to provide those children with the level of education that they would require.
In the Irish counties with the highest rates of infection, food and hospitality businesses are already shut. But the government believes these localised measures aren't working. So tonight, much more of Ireland is braced for a near total return to the lockdown of before. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Inniskeen.
The time is coming up to 6:20, our top story this evening. Wales will go into a short, sharp national lockdown from Friday. Almost everyone must stay at home.
Here goes.
And how taking the plunge into cold water could help scientists develop treatments for dementia.
Coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, Everton and England goalkeeper Jordan Pickford won't face disciplinary action following his collision with Virgil van Dijk, which injured the Liverpool defender in Saturday's Merseyside derby.
Safa and Marwa were born joined at the head, conjoined twins, a very rare condition. They were flown to London from their home in Pakistan, and after more than 50 hours of surgery and months of hospital care at Great Ormond Street, they were finally ready to go home. Our medical editor Fergus Walsh spoke to the family before they left.
Twin sisters with a special bond. It's now just over a year and a half since Safa and Marwa were separated.
Back to Safa. That's it. That's good. To Marwa.
They're still having physical therapy, which they clearly enjoy. But they've been through a lot to get here, and neither has emerged unscathed. The girls were born joined at the head, an extremely rare condition. They'd never seen each other's faces. The BBC followed their incredible journey as, over 4 months, they underwent more than 50 hours of surgery. Safa and Marwa's skull was one long tube. Their brains were misshapen and interconnected. Separating them involved a huge team at Great Ormond Street Hospital, with every stage, every stitch planned in minute detail. All of it was paid for by a private donor. Once the twins were finally separated, surgeons created a rounded skull for each of them, using pieces of shared bone.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
For their mother Zainab, the surgeons are heroes. This, the moment she was told they'd both survived. The road to recovery has been long and progress slow. Nonetheless, Zainab was delighted to be taking them home at last.
Thanks
to Allah, they have got very good progress, especially Marwa. She only needs little bit support for her to take the mobility her further. And we will take good care of Safa, and hopefully she will start walking as well.
In theatre, the surgeons had to make a near impossible choice.
There's something oozing deep down there that I can't see at the moment.
Only one twin could receive some key blood vessels that nourished both their brains. They were given to Marwa, the weaker twin. But as a result, Safa had a stroke. Safa now has permanent damage to her brain and may never walk.
I feel Marwa has done really well and carries on making great progress. So when I look at the whole family, yes, it was probably the right thing to do for the whole family. But for Safa, as an individual, I'm not so sure. It's a decision that I made as a surgeon. It's a decision that we made as a team, and it's a decision we have to live with.
And does it still trouble you?
Yes, very much so. I think it always will.
Both girls have learning difficulties, but the family say they have no regrets, and whatever the future holds, Marwa and Safa will face it together, as sisters and twins, but also separate individuals. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
The inquiry into the Manchester Arena bombing has heard from a man who described seeing suicide bomber Salman Abedi in the moments before he detonated his device. Neil Hatfield was in the foyer of the arena in May 2017, picking up his daughters from the Ariana Grande concert. Judith Moritz reports.
Bent under the weight of his rucksack, Salman Abedi arrived at Manchester Arena intent on murder. He didn't want to be seen and headed to an area not covered by CCTV. But he was spotted. Neil Hatfield was at the arena to collect his 4 daughters from the Ariana Grande concert.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
Today, Mr. Hatfield told the public inquiry that he saw a man with a heavy rucksack lying down on the floor.
I thought, suicide bomber, straight away, without Very little doubt in my mind. It was, honestly, my heart was racing. He was dressed all in black. He looked like a terrorist. He looked like a, I don't know how to explain it, like a Bond villain. I thought it was a bomb straight away. I don't know why. I just knew it in my mind.
CCTV shows that there were stewards nearby. Neil Hatfield says he thought they were aware of Abedi and that the police had been told, but against their own orders, they weren't in the room. These British Transport Police officers were given commendation awards after the attack. Today, PC Jessica Buller admitted that she'd taken an unacceptable break lasting more than 2 hours during her shift. When she came back on patrol, she'd just missed Salman Abedi walking into the lobby from the station. Last week, the inquiry heard evidence from a merchandise officer who said she'd seen Abedi before the bomb went off and that she'd pointed him out to PC Buller. But today, the PC said she's confident that conversation didn't happen. At the moment the bomb exploded, the British Transport Police officers on shift were all standing together at Victoria Station outside the arena. When they heard the blast, they ran towards it. PC Buller was the first officer to reach the foyer.
The training that I've had wasn't sufficient enough to deal with what I was witnessing.
Effectively, did you feel left in the lurch?
22 adults and children were killed. This week, the public inquiry will continue to hear from people who say they saw the bomber responsible for their murders before he carried out his suicide attack. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Manchester.
Some of today's other news now, and a project manager who worked on the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower has admitted binning notebooks containing her records of the works, despite knowing a public inquiry and police investigation were underway. Claire Williams was giving evidence to the Grenfell inquiry, which is investigating events leading up to the fire which killed 72 people in June 2017. The Home Secretary is considering holding a public inquiry into the 1974 Birmingham pub bombings after years of campaigning by the victims' families. 21 people were killed and more than 200 were injured in the explosions. West Midlands Mayor Andy Street described them as the biggest unsolved murders in recent British history. A fatal accident inquiry has found that a helicopter crash in the sea off Shetland in 2013, in which 4 people died, was caused by pilot error. The Super Puma, which had 18 passengers on board, hadn't maintained the correct speed as it approached its landing, but the reason for the mistake remains unknown. Could swimming in cold water be linked to a possible cure for dementia? Research by scientists at Cambridge University suggests that exposure to the cold can trigger the production of a protein that may protect the brain from degenerative diseases. Our chief environment correspondent Justin Rolat, a keen cold water swimmer himself, explains.
Fancy a dip? Yes, in cold water.
Oh, it's warm, yeah. Oh! We're away from the north so we can handle it.
So why might this help protect against dementia? The answer is a latent hibernation ability prompted by getting cold that it seems human beings retain. When animals hibernate, they lose some of the connections between their brain cells, but they are miraculously reformed when they wake in the spring, thanks in part to a protein discovered by the Cambridge University team. Look, which is where this place, Hampstead Heath at Lido, comes in. The scientists wanted to know if our bodies produce the same protein and needed a group of people who regularly get very cold.
Heat isn't probably as good for you as cold in that way.
After 3 years of winter blood tests, the subjects of the trial are gathered beside the chilly pool to hear the results of Professor Malucci's work.
We compared you to a bunch of people doing Tai Chi who didn't get cold, and none of them get increased levels of this protein, but many of you did. So what does it tell us? It tells us that cold does induce this protein in humans. You are the first sort of non-patient cohort to show that cold water swimming raises this protective protein, which is pretty cool.
But remember, winter swimming can be really dangerous if you're not used to it or have an underlying illness. So do be careful.
so we're never going to cure it.
The challenge now is to find a drug that stimulates the production of the protein in humans and, of course, to prove it really does help delay dementia.
If you slowed the progress of dementia by even a couple of years on a whole population, that would have an enormous impact economically and health-wise.
The link between cold water and dementia is a very promising line of research, but don't expect results soon. There is, the scientists say, lots more work to be done before it yields a potential treatment. Justin Rolat, BBC News, London.
Brave people. Talking of cold, here's Stav with the weather.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Yes, it was chilly last week, but at least we had some dry weather. And there's been quite a bit of dry weather around today for England and Wales. Some hazy sunshine, but it hasn't been dry everywhere. Scotland, Northern Ireland, it's been exceptionally wet. In fact, with the risk of some local flooding in places by the time the night's out. Now, this week remains unsettled. That's because we'll have an active jet stream bringing low pressure systems towards our shores. Wetter, windier, but what you will notice is going to be much milder, especially as we head on into Tuesday and Wednesday. You can see the pressure charts indicating that lots of weather fronts to the north and the west bringing the rain. Quite a few isobars there, so the wind will be picking up. But it's the rain that's been a real feature for Northern Ireland and Scotland, particularly western Scotland. Parts of Argyll, the hills and mountains of Argyll could see an excess of 50, 60 millimetres of rain by the time the night's out. So, like I mentioned, this could cause some issues on the roads there, the risk of some localised flooding. It also means it stays wet here throughout the night. Maybe it's something a little bit dry for Northern Ireland by the end of the night, but this weather front will spread across Wales and England as we head through the course of the night. Something a bit drier in its wake across the southwest later on, but notice the temperatures in double figures for many, so quite a mild night to come. The rain clears away from eastern England quite quickly tomorrow morning, then it's brighter with some sunshine, and then lots of showers will run up the Irish Sea, affecting western England, Wales, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, some merging together to produce longer spells of rain. Some could be heavy and thundery as well, and it stays windy and wet for the far north of Scotland. Look at these temperatures, though, in sunshine, because it's 17 to 19 Celsius, much milder than it's been of late. New area of low pressure will hurtle up from Biscay. This could bring perhaps some disruption to southern Britain through Wednesday, windy and very wet. Then it turns a little bit dry with a ridge of high pressure building in for Thursday. Sophie.
Stav, thank you. And that's it from us. Now the BBC News team's Where You Are. Goodbye.